Sometimes the things that break your heart the most are the only things that can save you. Jack Rourke had lost everything. His marriage, his savings, his pride, and now stood holding the keys to what everyone called his father's final insult, a falling down barn on worthless land. His ex-wife laughed when she heard about the inheritance. His in-laws called it a scam. Even his 12-year-old son rolled his eyes at the old wooden structure that leaned like it might collapse any day. But Jack had nowhere else to go. With his last $100 and a truck full of their belongings, he and his son moved to the forgotten farm in rural Ohio. The barn was all they had left: rotting wood, rusted metal, and decades of neglect. Everyone said he was a fool for believing it could be worth anything. But as Jack began cleaning out the old structure, he found something his father had left behind. Something that would change everything. What had his father been hiding all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the overgrown pasture as Jack Rourke stepped out of his battered pickup truck, the engine's final cough echoing across the silent farmland. His 12-year-old son Tommy remained in the passenger seat, arms crossed, staring at his phone screen with the determination of someone trying to will himself somewhere else entirely. "Come on." "A kiddo," Jack said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd made too many promises he couldn't keep. "Let's take a look at what we've got." Tommy didn't move. "This is stupid, Dad. There's no cell service out here." "There's nothing out here." Jack couldn't argue with that assessment. The property stretched for nearly 40 acres, but it might as well have been on the moon for all the life it showed. Weeds had reclaimed what once must have been cultivated fields. A farmhouse sat about 100 yards from the barn, its white paint peeling like old skin, shutters hanging at odd angles. The whole place whispered of abandonment, of dreams that had dried up and blown away with the autumn leaves. But it was the barn that dominated the landscape, a massive structure that had clearly seen better days. Red paint clung stubbornly to patches of weathered wood, while other sections had faded to the color of old leather. The roof sagged in the middle like an old man's back, and one of the large front doors hung crooked on rusted hinges. Yet despite its obvious decay, there was something undeniably substantial about it, as if it had been built to last centuries rather than decades. "Your grandfather built that barn in 1952, Jack said, though he wasn't sure Tommy was listening. "My dad used to tell me stories about helping with the construction when he was just a boy." Those were rare stories, Jack reflected. His father, Robert Rourke, had never been much of a talker. Even before the drinking got bad, before the arguments that drove Jack away to the city at 18, his father had been a man of few words and fewer displays of affection. Jack's memories of childhood were punctuated by long silences, by the sound of his father's work boots on the porch late at night, by the smell of motor oil and disappointment that seemed to cling to everything in their small house. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd fled to the city to escape this kind of life, only to find himself right back where he started, broke, divorced, and clinging to the hope that his father had left him something more than just a pile of rotting wood. Tommy finally emerged from the truck, his sneakers crunching on the gravel driveway. At 12, he was all elbows and knees, with his mother's dark hair and Jack's stubborn chin. He'd grown 3 inches in the past year, but somehow seemed smaller now than he had in their cramped apartment back in Columbus. The divorce had been hard on him, harder than either Jack or Sarah had wanted to admit. "Why couldn't Mom just let me stay with her?" Tommy asked, kicking at a stone. "Jessica's dad has a pool, and cable, and food that doesn't come from gas stations." Jack felt the familiar ache in his chest. Sarah had remarried 6 months after their divorce was final, moving in with her new husband and his teenage daughter in a suburb that might as well have been another planet. The house had a 3-car garage and a kitchen island bigger than Jack's entire apartment had been. When Tommy visited there, he got his own room with a gaming setup that probably cost more than Jack made in 2 months. because sometimes life gives you exactly what you need, even when it doesn't look like what you want, Jack said, repeating words his own father had once said to him. The memory surprised him. He'd thought he'd forgotten most of his father's rare attempts at wisdom. They walked toward the farmhouse first, Jack fishing the keys from his pocket. The lawyer had handed them over with barely concealed pity, along with a stack of papers that made it clear the property came with more debt than assets. Property taxes were 3 years behind. The well pump needed replacing. The electrical system hadn't been updated since the 1970s. On paper, inheriting the farm was like being handed a bill for someone else's mistakes. But as they climbed the front steps, Jack noticed details that spoke of care taken long ago. The porch railings were solid oak, hand-turned and still sturdy despite decades of weather. The front door was thick walnut, with beveled glass panels that caught the morning light in small rainbows. Someone had built this house to be a home, not just a structure. Inside, dust particles danced in the sunbeams that slanted through grimy windows. The rooms were larger than Jack remembered from his childhood visits, with high ceilings and hardwood floors that, beneath years of neglect, still showed the grain of quality lumber. His father's sparse furniture remained, a worn leather recliner, a kitchen table scarred from years of use, bookshelves lined with agricultural journals and repair manuals. Tommy wrinkled his nose at the musty smell. It's like a museum for old people. It's like a place where someone lived for 40 years, Jack corrected gently. Your grandfather wasn't much for throwing things away. That was an understatement. Robert Rourke had been what people politely called a collector and others called a pack rat. Every drawer Jack opened revealed carefully sorted collections of things that might someday be useful. Screws organized by size, lengths of wire wound into neat coils, coffee cans full of nuts and bolts. It was the hoarding of a man who'd lived through lean times, who understood that today's junk might be tomorrow's salvation. But it was in the kitchen that Jack found the first surprise. There, on the windowsill above the sink, sat a pair of worn work boots. Not just any boots. His father's favorites, the steel-toed Red Wings he'd worn every day for as long as Jack could remember. They'd been cleaned and oiled recently, the leather supple and dark. Someone had taken care of them, prepared them, as if they were waiting for their owner to return. Jack picked up one of the boots, feeling its familiar weight. His father had been a big man, with hands that could bend metal and shoulders broad enough to carry any burden. But these boots told a different story. They were worn thin at the heels, the steel toes scuffed from years of honest work. They spoke of a man who'd spent his life building things, fixing things, making things last. Dad, look at this, Tommy called from the living room. Jack found his son standing in front of a built-in bookshelf, holding a small, framed photograph. The picture showed a much younger Robert Rourke standing in front of the barn, but the barn in the photo was pristine, freshly painted, straight and strong, with neat gardens surrounding it. A woman stood beside Robert, her hand on his arm, smiling at something outside the frame. Is that Grandma? Tommy asked. Jack nodded, though he barely remembered his mother. She died when he was 8, leaving his father to raise him alone. Robert had never remarried, never even dated as far as Jack knew. He'd simply folded in on himself, becoming more distant with each passing year. She was beautiful, Tommy said, studying the photograph with the intensity he usually reserved for video games. Yeah, and she was. Jack took the picture, looking at his parents as they'd been in better times. His father looked happy in the photo, genuinely happy in a way Jack couldn't remember seeing in person. Your grandfather never got over losing her. I think that's why Jack stopped himself. There was no need to burden Tommy with the complicated grief that had shaped his own childhood. They spent the next hour exploring the house, each room revealing more evidence of a life lived quietly but purposefully. His father's bedroom was spartanly furnished but scrupulously clean. The bathroom had been recently updated with grab bars and a walk-in shower, concessions to age and failing health. A small office off the kitchen held a desk covered with papers, bills, and correspondence that would need sorting, But it was when they finally approached the barn that Jack felt the full weight of what he'd inherited. Up close, the structure was even more imposing than it had appeared from a distance. The foundation stones were massive granite blocks, fitted together with the precision of craftsmen who'd built things to outlast themselves. The frame was constructed from hand-hewn beams, each one a tree that had grown for decades before being shaped into its eternal purpose. The main doors stood 12 feet high and nearly as wide, designed to accommodate the large farm equipment of another era. Jack struggled with the rusted bolt that held them closed, the metal protesting with groans that echoed in the afternoon air. When the doors finally swung open, they revealed a cavernous space that stretched back into shadows. Dust motes swirled in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through gaps in the siding. The smell hit him first. Old hay, motor oil, and something else, something that reminded him of his childhood visits to the farm. It was the smell of work, of purpose, of a place where things got done. The barn was larger inside than it had any right to be, with a hayloft running along 3 sides and enough floor space to house several pieces of farm equipment. But what struck Jack most was how organized everything was. Despite years of abandonment, tools hung in neat rows on the walls. Workbenches stood ready for use, their surfaces clean and organized. Even the hay bales in the loft were stacked with military precision. "This is actually kind of cool," Tommy admitted, his voice echoing in the vast space. Jack smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in weeks. "Your grandfather was always particular about taking care of his things." They explored slowly, Tommy's initial reluctance giving way to curiosity. The barn held treasures from another era, a 1940s Ford tractor that looked like it might run with a little attention, hand tools that had been crafted by blacksmiths rather than manufactured in factories, and equipment whose purpose Jack could only guess at. It was in the northeast corner that Jack found something that stopped him cold. There, sitting on a workbench as if it had been placed there yesterday, was a coffee can with his name written on it in his father's careful handwriting. Inside the can was a folded piece of paper and something wrapped in oiled cloth. Jack's hands shook slightly as he unfolded the paper. His father's handwriting, always precise despite years of manual labor, spelled out a simple message. "For Jack, your real inheritance starts here. The boots will show you the way." The wrapped object was heavier than expected. When Jack pulled back the cloth, he found himself holding a brass compass, its surface polished to a mirror shine, despite its obvious age. The needle spun freely, but instead of pointing north, it seemed to quiver uncertainly, as if it were responding to something other than magnetic north. "What's that, Dad?" Tommy asked, peering over his father's shoulder. "I'm not sure," Jack admitted. But as he held the compass, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. His father had been many things, but he'd never been careless with words or gestures. If he'd left this compass with a message about boots and inheritances, it meant something. Jack looked around the barn with new eyes, seeing not just the accumulated debris of a lifetime, but the careful preservation of something important. His father had kept this place ready, maintained and organized, as if he'd been waiting for something or someone. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows when they finally locked up the barn and headed back to the truck. They'd spend the night in town at the only motel within 30 miles, but tomorrow they'd start the real work of making the farm habitable. Jack's bank account might be nearly empty, but for the first time since the divorce, he felt like he had something worth fighting for. "Dad," Tommy said as they drove toward town, "do you really think we can make this work?" Jack looked in the rearview mirror at the barn growing smaller in the distance, its weathered silhouette stark against the darkening sky. He thought about the compass in his pocket, about his father's boots waiting on the kitchen windowsill, about the message that promised his real inheritance was just beginning. "I don't know, son," he said honestly, "but I think your grandfather left us exactly what we need to find out." 3 days of hard work had transformed the farmhouse from uninhabitable to merely uncomfortable. Jack had managed to get the electricity running and convince the ancient furnace to produce something resembling heat. Tommy had claimed the upstairs bedroom that overlooked the barn, spending his evenings staring out the window with an expression Jack couldn't quite read. It was while cleaning the barn that Jack made the discovery that would change everything. He'd been working methodically, section by section, trying to create some order from decades of accumulated farm life. The work felt good, honest and straightforward, in a way his old job selling insurance never had. His hands, soft from years of office work, were already developing calluses. His back ached in places he'd forgotten existed. But it was the kind of ache that spoke of accomplishment rather than futility. Tommy had been helping, though with the reluctant energy of someone doing community service rather than contributing to his own future. Still, Jack was grateful for the company and the occasional conversation that broke the monotony of sorting and organizing. It was Tommy who noticed the loose floorboard. "Dad, this board is weird," he called from near the tack room. "It's like bouncy or something." Jack set down the box of rusted horseshoes he'd been sorting and walked over to where Tommy stood. The boy was right. One of the wide oak planks that made up the barn floor gave slightly when stepped on, as if it weren't properly secured to the joists beneath. Jack knelt and ran his fingers along the edges of the board. It was the same width as the others, but there was something different about it. The nail heads weren't rusted like the rest, and when he looked closely, he could see that they'd been removed and replaced multiple times. "Someone had been under this floor and recently. Hand me that crowbar," Jack said, pointing to the tool rack. It took only a few minutes of careful prying to lift the board. Beneath it, wrapped in an oiled top, was a wooden box about the size of a shoebox. Jack's heart hammered as he lifted it out, feeling the substantial weight that suggested something important lay inside. The box itself was beautiful, handcrafted from what looked like walnut, with dovetail joints that spoke of real craftsmanship. A small brass plate on the lid was engraved with his father's initials, R.M.R., Robert Michael Rourke. "What is it?" Tommy whispered, his earlier sullenness replaced by genuine curiosity. "I don't know yet." Jack's voice was hoarse with anticipation. The box wasn't locked, but the hinges protested with age as Jack opened the lid. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, was a leather-bound journal. The cover was water-stained and worn, but the binding was solid. Beneath the journal lay several folded papers and what looked like old photographs. Jack opened the journal carefully, mindful of the fragile pages. His father's handwriting filled the first page, but it was different from the confident script Jack remembered from grocery lists and repair notes. This handwriting was hurried, urgent, as if the words couldn't wait to be captured. May 15th, 1987. "They think I don't know. They think I'm just some farmer who got lucky with a good idea. But I know what they did. I know what they took. And I know where the real treasure is hidden. If something happens to me, if they succeed in destroying my reputation and taking everything I built, this journal will tell the truth. The collection isn't just valuable, it's proof. Proof of what my grandfather did. Proof of what they stole from our family. Proof that the Rourke name means something. I'm hiding this where only family will find it. Where someone who understands the value of hard work and honest labor will know to look. The barn has always been the heart of this place. It will keep our secrets until the time is right." Jack's hands trembled slightly as he turned the page. The next entry was dated 2 days later, May 17th, 1987. "Talked to the lawyer today. He says we have a case, but it could take years and cost more than I have. They're powerful, well-connected. I'm just a farmer who happened to invent something they wanted, but I'm not giving up. I've been documenting everything, every conversation, every meeting, every lie they told. The patents are safe, hidden where they'll never think to look. And the collection, that's my insurance policy. They can take my business, they can ruin my name, but they can't take what they don't know exists. Dad, what does it say?" Tommy leaned closer, trying to read over Jack's shoulder. Jack cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. "It says your grandfather was fighting for something. Something important." He continued reading, the journal entries painting a picture of a man under siege. Robert Rourke, it seemed, had been much more than the simple farmer Jack remembered. The entries spoke of inventions, of patents, of a business partnership that had gone catastrophically wrong. June 2nd, 1987. They offered me $10,000 today. $10,000 for something worth millions. They sat in my kitchen, drinking my coffee, and told me I should be grateful for their generosity. Said I could keep the farm, keep my dignity, if I just signed their papers and forgot about what really happened. I threw them out. Let them take me to court. Let them try to prove I stole what was mine to begin with. They don't know about the collection. They don't know about the real evidence. And they sure as hell don't know about what grandfather left buried under this barn. Jack's breath caught. He flipped through more pages, the entries becoming more cryptic but more urgent. August 14th, 1987. It's getting worse. They're not just trying to take the patents now. They're trying to destroy me completely. Started rumors that I'm drinking again, that I'm unreliable. Some of my customers are backing out of orders, but I finished the modifications to the barn today. The mechanism works perfectly. Even if they take everything else, they'll never find the collection. It's protected now, safe, until someone who deserves it comes looking. I just pray Jack will understand someday. I pray he'll forgive me for being too proud to tell him the truth while I was alive. The phone's shrill ring from the farmhouse cut through the afternoon silence like a blade. Jack startled, nearly dropping the journal. He'd had a phone connected the day before, mainly so Tommy could call his mother and so Sarah could reach them in case of emergency. "Stay here," Jack told Tommy, carefully closing the journal. "Don't touch anything else in that box." He jogged to the farmhouse, his mind spinning with questions. The phone continued its urgent ringing, and when Jack finally reached it, Sarah's voice crackled through the connection. "Jack, what the hell do you think you're doing?" The familiar edge in her voice immediately put him on the defensive. "Hello, Sarah. Nice to hear from you too. Don't get cute with me. I just got off the phone with my lawyer. You can't just disappear with Tommy without discussing it with me first. And taking him to live in some falling-down barn. Are you out of your mind?" Jack closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the day's discovery mixing with the familiar frustration of dealing with his ex-wife. "It's not a falling-down barn, Sarah. It's a farmhouse. A nice farmhouse, actually, once I get it fixed up." "Oh, really?" "Because Janet drove out there yesterday to check on Tommy, and she said the place looks like something out of a horror movie. No proper heat, no cable, and apparently Tommy told her there's no cell service." Janet, Sarah's sister, had never liked Jack, not even when he and Sarah were happily married. She'd probably driven the 30 miles specifically to find fault with their new living situation. "Janet doesn't know what she's talking about. And since when do you send people to spy on me? Since you decided to drag my son to the middle of nowhere without even discussing it with me." "Jack, be reasonable. You don't have a job. You don't have any money. And now you're trying to play farmer in a house that should probably be condemned." Jack felt his anger rising. But underneath it was something worse. Doubt. Sarah wasn't wrong about his financial situation. His unemployment benefits would run out in 3 months, and he'd already spent most of his remaining savings on basic repairs to make the farmhouse livable. "I'm trying to give us a fresh start, Sarah. Tommy and me. We needed to get away from what? From reality. Jack, this isn't some romantic movie where the struggling father finds happiness on the family farm. This is real life, and real life requires things like steady income and proper schools, and Tommy's enrolled in school here. A good school. A school with 12 kids in his grade, according to Janet. Jack, he needs stability. He needs to be around other children, needs activities, needs his father." The words came out harder than Jack intended. He needs his father, who gives a damn about more than how much money he makes or whether the neighbors think we're respectable enough. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Jack wondered if the connection had been lost. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was dangerously quiet. "I want him back, Jack. I want Tommy back by the end of the week, or I'm filing for emergency custody. I won't let you destroy his future because you're having some kind of midlife crisis." The line went dead. Jack stood in the kitchen, holding the silent phone, feeling like the walls were closing in around him. Through the window he could see Tommy still kneeling by the open floorboard, carefully examining something from the wooden box. His son was happy here, or at least happier than Jack had seen him in months. The boy had spent the morning actually talking about things, about how quiet it was at night, about the hawk he'd seen circling the barn, about whether they might get chickens. Small conversations, but more than they'd shared during the tense months leading up to the divorce. Now, Sarah wanted to take that away. She wanted to drag Tommy back to her suburban paradise, where he'd have his own room and cable television, but where Jack would see him maybe 2 weekends a month, where every conversation would be filtered through lawyers and custody agreements. Jack walked back to the barn, his footsteps heavy on the gravel. Tommy looked up as he approached, holding one of the photographs from the box. "Dad, look at this. I think it's great, Grandpa." The photograph was old, probably from the 1940s, showing a man in work clothes standing next to a much younger version of the barn. But what caught Jack's attention wasn't the man or the building. It was what the man was holding. In his hands was the same brass compass Jack had found in the coffee can, and he was pointing it towards something outside the frame of the photograph. "Tommy," Jack said, sitting down heavily beside his son, "how would you feel about your mom wanting you to come back to Columbus?" Tommy's face went carefully blank, the expression he'd perfected during the worst days of the divorce. "Do I have to?" "I don't know yet. Maybe." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, turning the photograph over in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was small but determined. "I like it here, Dad. I know it's weird and there's no Wi-Fi and the shower makes funny noises, but I like it. I like working on stuff with you. I like that you're not always stressed about work and bills and stuff." Jack felt something break loose in his chest. "Even if it means living in a house that needs a lot of work? Even if it means being far from your friends? My friends stopped calling after you, and Mom got divorced anyway." Tommy shrugged with the practiced indifference of a kid who'd learned to protect himself from disappointment. "Besides, this place has mysteries. That's way cooler than cable TV." Jack looked at the journal still open in his lap, at the photograph of his grandfather holding the compass, at his son who was choosing uncertainty over comfort for the first time in his young life. "Then I guess we'd better figure out what your great-grandfather was trying to tell us, Jack," said. Tommy grinned, the first completely unguarded smile Jack had seen from him since before the divorce papers were filed. They spent the rest of the afternoon going through the contents of the wooden box. Besides the journal and photographs, there were hand-drawn maps of the property, copies of legal documents, and several letters written in his grandfather's careful script. Each piece of paper seemed to point toward the same conclusion. The Rourke family had been guardians of something valuable, something worth protecting for generations. But as the sun began to set and they prepared to close up the barn for the night, Jack couldn't shake Sarah's words. She was right about his precarious financial situation. She was right about Tommy needing stability. And she was definitely right that playing treasure hunter wouldn't pay the bills or secure their future. Still, as they walked back toward the farmhouse, Tommy chattering excitedly about maps and compasses and family secrets, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the sense that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The question was whether that would be enough to convince a family court judge to let them stay. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Jack was replacing rotted boards on the front porch when a dusty sedan pulled into the driveway. A woman in her 70s stepped out, moving with the careful precision of someone whose bones had earned their aches honestly. "You must be Robert's boy," she called, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "I'm Martha Henley. I live about 2 miles down the road." Jack wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over to greet her. Martha Henley had the weathered look of someone who'd spent her life outdoors, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and clothes that prioritized function over fashion. "Jack Rourke," he said, extending his hand. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Henley. Just Martha, please. I was sorry to hear about your father's passing. He was a good man, even if he kept to himself these last years." There was something in her tone that suggested she knew more about his father than most neighbors would. Jack found himself curious. "Would you like some coffee?" "I just made a pot." "That would be lovely." They settled at the kitchen table, Martha's eyes taking in the details of the house with the practiced assessment of someone familiar with the space. "I used to come by occasionally," she explained, noticing his questioning look. "Your father wasn't much for accepting help, but I'd bring him meals sometimes when the weather was bad. Made sure he was taking care of himself." Jack felt a stab of guilt. He should have been the one checking on his father, bringing meals, making sure he wasn't alone. But the years of silence between them had seemed impossible to bridge. "He never mentioned having neighbors who looked out for him," Jack said. Martha smiled. "Robert wasn't much for mentioning anything, was he? But he talked about you sometimes. Worried about you, especially after your divorce. He kept newspaper clippings about your insurance company, anything that mentioned your name." The guilt deepened. His father had been keeping track of his life while Jack had been actively avoiding any contact with the farm. "Mrs. Henley." "Martha, can I ask you something? Did my father ever talk about his past? About the farm, or his father, or—" Jack paused, unsure how much to reveal. "About anything valuable that might have been hidden here?" Martha's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. She set it down carefully and studied Jack's face for a long moment. "What have you found?" The directness of the question surprised him. "You know about something, don't you? I know your father spent 40 years looking for something your grandfather hid. I know he believed your great-grandfather was involved in something during the Civil War that most people around here would rather forget. And I know he never stopped believing that this property held secrets worth protecting." Jack felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of secrets?" Martha stood and walked to the window that overlooked the barn. "Your great-grandfather Thomas Rourke wasn't just a farmer. During the war, this area was part of the Underground Railroad. Families like mine and yours helped escaped slaves make their way north to Canada. I had no idea. Most people didn't. It wasn't the kind of thing you advertised, even after the war ended. But Thomas was more than just a station master on the railroad. According to the stories passed down in my family, he was involved in moving something else north, something the Union Army wanted kept safe from Confederate raiders." Jack thought about the journal entries, about references to collections and things buried under the barn. What kind of something? Martha turned back to face him. "Gold. A substantial amount of Union gold that was being transported to Canada for safekeeping. The story goes that Thomas volunteered to hide it temporarily when word came that Confederate cavalry was in the area. But the war ended before the gold could be retrieved, and Thomas took the secret to his grave. And my father believed this story? Your father spent 30 years researching it. He had maps, old letters, military records, everything he could find about troop movements in this area during 1863 and 1864. He was convinced that not only was the gold real, but that Thomas had left clues about where it was hidden. Jack's mind raced back to the previous day's discoveries. The journal, the compass, the photographs of his grandfather pointing towards something outside the camera's range. "Martha, there's something I need to show you." 20 minutes later, they stood in the barn with the wooden box open between them. Martha examined each item with the careful attention of someone well-versed in local history. When she finished reading the journal, she looked up at Jack with something approaching excitement. "Your father was closer than I thought," she said. "These references to the collection. I think he figured out that Thomas wasn't just hiding Union gold. He was hiding artifacts, documents, maybe even personal items that belonged to the people who passed through here on the railroad." She picked up one of the hand-drawn maps. "Look at this. This shows the barn, but also underground passages. I've heard stories about tunnels that connected properties in this area, ways for people to move unseen between safe houses. You think there are tunnels under this barn? I think your great-grandfather built this barn over something that was already here. Something that served a purpose long before it became a place to store hay and farm equipment." Jack felt a mixture of excitement and overwhelming responsibility. If Martha was right, the property wasn't just his inheritance. It was a piece of history, a monument to courage and sacrifice that deserved protection, but it was also potentially valuable in ways that could solve his immediate problems. Martha, if we found something like that, gold, artifacts, historically significant items, what would happen to them legally? Martha's expression grew serious. That would depend on a lot of factors. Items of historical significance might belong to the state or federal government. Personal effects might belong to descendants of the original owners. Gold, she shrugged. Gold might belong to whoever finds it, but proving ownership could be complicated. The sound of a school bus stopping at the end of the driveway interrupted their conversation. Tommy would be home soon, full of questions about what Jack had learned during his day of investigation. Martha, would you be willing to help us research this? You obviously know more about the local history than I do. I'd be honored, she said. But Jack, you should know. Your father wasn't the only one interested in what might be hidden here. Over the years, there have been others asking questions, making inquiries about the property. Some of them weren't the type you'd want to invite for dinner. What kind of others? Developers, mostly. People with enough money to make serious offers for land they claimed they wanted for agricultural purposes. But farmland around here doesn't sell for the kind of money they were offering. Martha paused. And then there were the history buffs, people who claimed to be researchers but asked too many specific questions about your family and not enough about local history in general. Jack felt a chill. That had nothing to do with the October air. You think people know about what might be hidden here? I think rumors have been circulating for decades. Your father was discreet, but he wasn't secretive enough. Word gets around in small towns, especially when someone spends years researching Civil War gold and Underground Railroad routes. Tommy's voice carried across the farmyard as he called out his arrival. Jack quickly gathered the items back into the wooden box. Martha, would you mind not mentioning this to anyone else? At least until we figure out what we're dealing with. Of course. But Jack, Martha's weathered hand touched his arm. Be careful. If there really is something valuable hidden here, and if other people suspect it exists, you and Tommy could be in more danger than you realize. As Martha drove away, Jack stood in the barn doorway watching the dust settle on the gravel road. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows, and for the first time since inheriting the property, he felt genuinely afraid, not afraid of failure or poverty, or even of losing custody of Tommy, afraid of something much more immediate and dangerous, the possibility that their treasure hunt had already attracted the wrong kind of attention. Tommy bounded into the barn, backpack slung over his shoulder and face bright with the excitement of someone who'd spent the day thinking about mysteries and adventures. Dad, did you find anything else? Did you figure out what the compass does? Jack looked at his son's eager face and made a decision. They would continue investigating, but they would be smart about it, careful. They wouldn't just be treasure hunters anymore, they'd be guardians, protectors of whatever legacy Thomas Rourke had left behind. We're going to find out, Jack promised. But first, we're going to make sure we're ready for whatever we discover. As they walked back toward the farmhouse together, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The sensation followed them all the way to the front door, and even after they were safely inside with the locks turned, Jack found himself checking the windows and listening for sounds that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the farm. The treasure hunt had begun. But so had something else, something that would test not just their determination to uncover the truth, but their ability to protect what they found. The brass compass had been calling to Jack for 3 days. Each time he held it, the needle would spin wildly for a moment before settling into a direction that definitely wasn't magnetic north. It pointed consistently toward the same corner of the barn, the northeast section, where the foundation stones were largest and oldest. Tommy had become fascinated with the instrument, spending his after-school hours testing it in different locations around the property. The readings were always the same. Inside the barn, the needle pointed northeast. Outside, it swung to aim directly at the barn itself. It's like it knows something we don't, Tommy said, watching the needle quiver as Jack held the compass near the massive foundation stones. Maybe it does. They'd been working methodically, following Martha Henley's advice to document everything before disturbing anything. Jack had borrowed a metal detector from the local hardware store, and the results had been intriguing. The entire northeast corner of the barn registered strong metal readings, not just at ground level but several feet down. "Dad, look at this." Tommy was kneeling beside one of the foundation stones, running his fingers along what appeared to be scratches in the granite. But as Jack knelt beside his son, he realized the marks weren't random, they were deliberate. Carved symbols that had been weathered by more than a century of seasons. "It looks like," Tommy squinted at the markings, "like an arrow. And some numbers?" Jack pulled out his phone and took several pictures of the carved symbols. In the harsh light of the flash, the markings stood out clearly against the grey stone. There was indeed an arrow, pointing downward and slightly to the east. Below it were numbers, 1863, 1863, Jack murmured. "What do you think that means?" "Maybe it's a date, like June 18th, 1863. Jack felt his pulse quicken. 1863 was right in the middle of the Civil War. Exactly when Martha's stories suggested Thomas Rourke might have been hiding Union gold. Or maybe it's directions, Tommy continued, his mind working with the rapid-fire connections that made 12-year-olds such natural puzzle solvers. Like 18 steps east, 6 steps down, 3 feet deep. Only one way to find out. Jack had purchased basic excavation tools. Nothing fancy, just a shovel, a pickaxe, and a small sledgehammer for breaking through obstacles. If they were going to dig, they needed to do it properly and safely. "First we measure," Jack said, pulling out the tape measure. 18 steps east from this stone. They paced it off together, Tommy counting while Jack measured. 18 paces brought them to a spot about 6 feet from the barn's eastern wall, in an area that looked like every other section of dirt floor. 6 steps down, Tommy said. "That's got to mean 6 feet down, right?" "Probably. But we're not digging a 6-foot hole without knowing what we're looking for." Jack knelt and cleared away the loose dirt and debris. "Let's start shallow and see what we find." The first foot of digging revealed nothing but packed earth and the occasional rusty nail or piece of broken pottery, the kind of debris that accumulated around any building over the course of a century. But as Jack's shovel bit deeper, the soil changed character, becoming softer and more recently disturbed. "Dad," Tommy's voice was tight with excitement. "The metal detector's going crazy." Jack looked up to see his son sweeping the borrowed device over the area they'd been digging. The machine was producing a steady, high-pitched whine that indicated substantial metal deposits just below the surface. "Let me try the compass again." Jack pulled the antique brass instrument from his pocket. The needle spun frantically when he held it over the excavation site, as if it were responding to powerful magnetic forces directly beneath them. "This is it," Jack said with growing certainty. "Whatever Thomas hid, it's right here." Another hour of careful digging revealed the first artificial object, a corner of what appeared to be a wooden crate, preserved by the dry conditions beneath the barn floor. Jack worked more carefully now, using his hands to brush away soil and reveal the shape of the container. It was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 2 feet square and a foot deep. The wood was dark with age, but still solid, held together with iron bands that explained the metal detector's enthusiasm. "Can we open it?" Tommy whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make their discovery disappear. Jack examined the crate carefully. It wasn't locked, just sealed with a simple latch that had rusted solid over the decades. A few careful taps with the hammer broke the rust away, and the latch opened with a metallic protest that seemed to echo through the barn. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oiled canvas, was another wooden box, this one much more sophisticated than the storage crate. It was made from the same quality walnut as the box that had contained his father's journal, with the same precise craftsmanship and attention to detail. Jack lifted it carefully from its resting place. It was heavier than expected, with the solid weight of something substantial inside. "More journals?" Tommy asked. "I don't think so." This box had no nameplate, no identifying marks, but it radiated the same sense of importance as the one they'd found under the loose floorboard. Jack opened it slowly, conscious that he might be the first person to see its contents since Thomas Rourke had placed them there more than a century ago. The box was lined with deep blue velvet, and nestled within that lining was an assortment of objects that took Jack's breath away. Gold coins, each one gleaming despite their age, filled most of the space. But it wasn't just the gold that caught his attention. It was the other items carefully arranged around the coins. A set of silver buttons, obviously from a military uniform. A small leather pouch containing what appeared to be precious stones. A bundle of letters tied with a ribbon that had faded from red to pale pink. And at the center of it all, a daguerreotype photograph of a young black woman holding the hand of a small child. Is that real gold? Tommy breathed. Jack picked up one of the coins, feeling its substantial weight. The date read 1862, and the inscription identified it as a $20 gold piece, a double eagle. Even in his limited knowledge of coin collecting, Jack knew such pieces were worth far more than their gold content. I think so. Jack's voice was hoarse with wonder. I think this is just the beginning. He counted the coins carefully. 37 double eagles, each one a small fortune in its own right. But as he examined the other items, Jack began to understand that the real value of Thomas's cash wasn't monetary. The letters, when he opened them carefully, were written in different hands. Some were in English, some in what appeared to be French, and others in languages Jack couldn't identify. But all of them seemed to be personal messages, letters between family members, expressions of love and hope and determination to survive. The photograph was the most powerful artifact of all. The woman's face showed the dignity and strength that Jack had seen in historical documentaries about the Underground Railroad. The child beside her couldn't have been more than Tommy's age, but his eyes held wisdom beyond his years. These belong to people who came through here, Jack said quietly. People your great-great-grandfather helped escape slavery. Tommy reached out to touch the photograph, his finger barely grazing the glass. They were real people. With families and everything, that's right. And Thomas kept their belongings safe, probably hoping he could return them someday. Jack felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just a treasure hunt anymore. It was archaeology, historical preservation, family legacy all rolled into one. The coins might solve his financial problems, but the personal items were irreplaceable connections to courage and sacrifice that deserved respect. Dad, there's something else in here. Tommy was pointing to a small compartment built into the lid of the box. Jack hadn't noticed it at first. The craftsmanship was so skillful that the hidden space was nearly invisible until you knew where to look. Inside the compartment was a single sheet of paper, folded small and written in Thomas Rourke's careful handwriting. For my descendants, this is only the first cache. The compass will guide you to the others when the time is right. Protect what cannot be replaced. Use what can be spared. Trust no one with the full truth until the last secret is revealed. The barn holds more than you can imagine. Thomas M. Rourke, September 1864. Jack stared at the note, its implications slowly sinking in. This wasn't the end of their treasure hunt. It was the beginning. Thomas had hidden multiple caches around the property, and the compass was designed to guide them from one to the next. There's more? Tommy's eyes were wide with excitement. Apparently so. Jack looked around the barn with new appreciation. If Thomas had hidden one cache this carefully, how many others might be waiting beneath their feet? But as the excitement of discovery began to fade, practical concerns crept back in. Jack's phone had been ringing periodically throughout the afternoon, calls he'd been ignoring while focused on their excavation. When he finally checked the missed calls, his stomach dropped. 7 calls from Sarah, 3 from her lawyer. 2 from a number he didn't recognize, but suspected might be Child Protective Services. Tommy, we need to clean this up and get back to the house. Your mom's been calling. They carefully repacked the cash, but Jack kept out 3 of the gold coins, enough to prove their discovery was real if he needed to show someone. Not so many that losing them would be devastating. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Jack's phone rang again. This time he answered. Jack, thank God. Sarah's voice was tight with anxiety. I've been trying to reach you all afternoon. Sorry, we were working in the barn. What's wrong? What's wrong is that I called the school to check on Tommy's progress, and they said he's been coming to class dirty and tired. They said he told his teacher that you've been making him dig holes in some old barn. Jack closed his eyes, recognizing how their innocent treasure hunting might sound to concerned educators. Sarah, it's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. You're so obsessed with whatever delusion you've cooked up about that property that you're neglecting our son. Jack, I'm driving out there tomorrow. I'm taking Tommy home with me, and then we're going to court. The line went dead. Jack stood in his driveway, holding the silent phone, feeling the weight of the gold coins in his pocket. They'd found proof that his father's stories were true, that the property held secrets worth protecting and treasures worth finding. But if Sarah followed through on her threat, none of it would matter. Tommy would be gone, the farm would be sold to pay legal bills, and the Rourke family legacy would be scattered to the winds. Jack looked at his son, who was studying the compass with the intense concentration of someone trying to solve a puzzle that mattered. Dad, is Mom going to make me go back with her? I don't know, son. But I promise you this. Whatever happens, we're going to make sure your great-great-grandfather's story gets told. And we're going to make sure the people who trusted him with their most precious belongings get the respect they deserve. Tommy nodded solemnly, as if he understood that they were guardians of something much larger than themselves. As they walked toward the farmhouse together, Jack made a decision. Tomorrow, when Sarah arrived, he would show her what they'd found. He would explain that this wasn't neglect or delusion, it was discovery. It was history. It was exactly the kind of adventure that could give a 12-year-old boy something to be proud of, something to build his future on. He just hoped it would be enough. Martha Henley arrived at sunrise, her sedan kicking up dust clouds as she navigated the rutted driveway with obvious urgency. Jack met her at the kitchen door, coffee already brewing and his face showing the strain of a sleepless night. I brought something you need to see, Martha said without preamble, clutching a manila envelope to her chest. Found it in my late husband's papers last night, after I got to thinking about our conversation yesterday. Jack poured coffee, while Martha spread the contents of the envelope across the kitchen table. Old photographs, hand-drawn maps, and what appeared to be official correspondence filled the space between the salt and pepper shakers. My husband was more involved in local Civil War history than I let on yesterday, Martha said. He spent 20 years corresponding with historians, genealogists, anyone who might have information about Underground Railroad activities in this area. She pointed to one of the photographs, a group of serious-faced men standing in front of a building Jack didn't recognize. That's your great-great-grandfather, Thomas Rourke, third from the left. Jack studied the image. Thomas Rourke had been a big man, broad-shouldered like his father Robert, with the kind of weathered hands that spoke of honest labor. But his eyes held something else. Intelligence, determination, and perhaps a touch of defiance. Who are the other men? Local abolitionists. The photograph was taken in 1863, probably right around the time Thomas would have been most active in hiding escaped slaves. Martha pulled out a letter written on official-looking letterhead. But this is what you really need to see. The letter was dated 1962, nearly a century after the Civil War, and addressed to Martha's husband from someone at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Dear Mr. Henley, thank you for your inquiry regarding Union Army gold shipments through Ohio during 1863-1864. While most records from that period remain classified, I can confirm that substantial amounts of government gold were moved through your area during the time frame you specified. Of particular interest is your mention of Thomas Rourke. Our records show that Mr. Rourke was officially contracted by the Union Army to provide secure storage and transport services for unspecified materials during the summer of 1864. Payment records indicate he received significant compensation for these services, far more than would be typical for agricultural products or standard freight hauling. Unfortunately, the specific nature of Mr. Rourke's services and the final disposition of the materials he handled remain classified under current federal security guidelines. However, I can tell you that inquiries about this matter have been received from other parties over the years, suggesting ongoing interest in Mr. Rourke's wartime activities. I hope this information proves helpful to your research. Jack read the letter twice, his pulse quickening with each paragraph. Martha, this proves that Thomas was working directly with the Union Army, and if payment records still exist, then there's documentation of exactly what he was hired to do. Martha nodded grimly. But Jack, look at the date on this letter. 1962. That means people have been asking questions about your family for 60 years. The implications were sobering. If government officials and historians had been tracking the Rourke family's Civil War connections for decades, then the rumors about hidden treasure weren't local folklore. They were documented historical curiosity that had attracted attention from far beyond rural Ohio. There's more, Martha continued, pulling out a hand-drawn map that looked similar to the ones Jack had found in his father's journal. My husband drew this based on conversations he had with your father in the 1980s. Look at the markings. The map showed not just the barn and farmhouse, but an entire network of underground connections. Dotted lines indicated tunnels running between the barn and several locations on surrounding properties. X marks showed what appeared to be multiple cache sites, far more than Jack had imagined. How many hiding places do you think Thomas created? Jack asked. Based on what my husband learned from your father, at least a dozen. Maybe more. Martha's finger traced the tunnel routes. The barn wasn't just a hiding place, it was the center of an entire underground transportation system. Tommy appeared in the doorway, backpack slung over his shoulder and ready for school. But when he saw the maps spread across the table, education took a back seat to adventure. Are those treasure maps? He asked, dropping his backpack and leaning over the table. Historical documents, Jack corrected, though he couldn't hide his own excitement. Martha, I need to show you what we found yesterday. 20 minutes later, they stood in the barn with the walnut box open between them. Martha's reaction to the gold coins was immediate and professional. She examined them with the practiced eye of someone who understood their historical significance, beyond their monetary value. But it was the personal items that truly captured her attention. She held the daguerreotype photograph with the reverence of someone handling a religious artifact. Do you realize what this represents? She whispered. This is documentation of lives that history usually forgets. The Underground Railroad saved thousands of people, but most of them remain anonymous. This photograph gives faces to the courage. Tommy thinks there are more caches hidden around the property. Tommy's probably right. Martha carefully returned the photograph to its velvet lining. But Jack, you need to understand something. If word gets out about what you found, this place will become a circus. Historical societies, treasure hunters, government officials, media, everyone will want a piece of this story. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe it's time the story was told. Martha's expression grew troubled. Maybe, but first you need to understand who else has been interested in this property over the years. She pulled out the final item from her envelope, a business card that looked official and expensive. The name read, Blackstone Historical Acquisitions, with an address in Chicago and a phone number that suggested serious money behind the operation. They contacted me 6 months ago, asking questions about your father and whether he'd ever mentioned finding anything of historical value on the property. Offered me a substantial finder's fee if I could arrange an introduction. Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. What did you tell them? I told them your father was a private man who didn't discuss his business with neighbors. But Jack, these weren't casual collectors. They had detailed information about Thomas Rourke, about Union Army gold shipments, about Underground Railroad routes through this area. They knew things that aren't in any history book. What kind of things? They knew about the compass. They asked specifically whether your father had ever shown me an antique brass compass that gave unusual readings. Jack's hand moved instinctively to his pocket, where the compass rested like a talisman. If strangers knew about the compass, then the Rourke family secrets weren't as secret as he'd believed. "Martha, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Are you the only person who knew my father was searching for hidden treasure?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands smoothing the maps on the workbench. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of confession. "No. Over the years, your father confided in several people. The local librarian helped him research property records. A geology professor from the state university consulted on soil samples. An antique dealer in Columbus examined some items your father had found." Jack felt his carefully constructed sense of security crumbling. How many people are we talking about? Maybe a dozen all told. But Jack, these were people your father trusted. People who understood the historical significance of what he was looking for. Or people who understood the monetary value. The harsh reality was setting in. The treasure hunt wasn't a private family adventure. It was the continuation of a search that had attracted attention from historians, collectors, and possibly much less scrupulous individuals over the course of decades. Tommy had been listening to the conversation with growing alarm. "Dad, does this mean we're in trouble?" Jack looked at his son's worried face and made a decision that would define everything that followed. They weren't going to hide. They weren't going to run. They were going to see this through, but they were going to be smart about it. "No, son. It means we're going to be very careful about who we trust and very thorough about protecting what we find." Jack turned to Martha. "I need your help. Not just with the historical research, but with understanding who else might be interested in what we're discovering." Martha nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "I need to know everything your husband learned about Thomas Rourke and the Underground Railroad. I need copies of every letter, every map, every piece of documentation you have. And I need to know exactly who has been asking questions about this property over the years. That's going to take some time to organize. We don't have much time. My ex-wife is coming here today, threatening to take Tommy back to Columbus. If I'm going to convince her that staying here is in his best interest, I need to show her that this isn't just some desperate treasure hunt. I need to prove that we're guardians of something important, something worth protecting." Martha smiled for the first time that morning. "Then I'd better get started. But Jack, promise me something. Whatever you find, whatever you decide to do with it, make sure the story gets told. The people who trusted Thomas Rourke with their lives deserve to be remembered." As Martha drove away, Jack stood in the barn doorway, holding the compass and looking out at the 40 acres that suddenly seemed to hold infinite possibilities and dangers in equal measure. Tommy's school bus would arrive in 10 minutes. Sarah would arrive sometime that afternoon. And somewhere out there, people with substantial resources and questionable motives were asking questions about the Rourke family legacy. Jack opened the compass and watched the needle spin toward the northeast corner of the barn. Thomas Rourke had hidden his secrets well, but he'd also left clues for family members smart enough and determined enough to follow them. The question wasn't whether they could find the remaining caches. The question was whether they could find them before someone else did. Sarah's BMW looked as out of place on the farm road as a yacht in a cornfield. Jack watched from the kitchen window as she navigated the ruts and potholes with obvious distress. Her pristine car suffering indignities it was never designed to endure. She emerged from the vehicle wearing clothes more appropriate for a business meeting than a rural confrontation. Tailored slacks, a crisp blouse, and shoes with heels that immediately sank into the soft earth of the farmyard. Her expression suggested she viewed the entire property as confirmation of her worst fears about Jack's judgment. "This is what you dragged our son to?" she said without preamble, gesturing at the farmhouse with obvious dismay. "Jack, look at this place. Really look at it." Jack had to admit that Sarah's perspective wasn't entirely unfair. The farmhouse, despite his efforts, still showed decades of deferred maintenance. The barn leaned at an angle that suggested structural problems. The entire property radiated the kind of rural poverty that suburban professionals found deeply uncomfortable. "It's a work in progress," Jack said. "Come inside. Let me show you what I've accomplished. I didn't drive 40 miles to admire your carpentry skills. I came to get Tommy and take him somewhere he can have a normal childhood." But despite her protests, Sarah followed him into the farmhouse. Jack had spent the morning preparing for this moment, organizing his discoveries and planning his arguments. The kitchen table was covered with photocopies of historical documents, maps and carefully selected items from Thomas's cache. "Sarah, before you make any decisions about Tommy's future, you need to understand what we've discovered here." Sarah's expression softened slightly as she examined the materials. Despite their marital problems, she'd always been an intelligent woman with a genuine interest in history and genealogy. "What am I looking at?" she asked, picking up one of Martha's photographs. "Evidence that Tommy's great-great-great-grandfather was a hero. Evidence that this property isn't just an old farm. It's a piece of American history that's been hidden for more than a century." Jack walked her through the discoveries methodically, starting with his father's journal and progressing through the cache they'd found beneath the barn floor. He showed her the gold coins, the personal artifacts, and Thomas's note promising additional hidden treasures. Sarah listened with growing fascination, her businesslike demeanor gradually giving way to genuine curiosity. "You're telling me that all of this has been hidden under that old barn for over 100 years? "That's exactly what I'm telling you. And there's more, Sarah, much more. Thomas left clues about additional caches, and we've been following them systematically. We, Tommy and me. Sarah, you should see him when we're working together. He's engaged, excited, learning about history and genealogy and problem-solving. He's not just playing video games and complaining about being bored. He's discovering that he comes from a family that did important things." Sarah walked to the window and looked out at the barn, her lawyer-trained mind obviously processing the implications of what Jack had shown her. "This is all very interesting from a historical perspective," she said finally. "But interesting doesn't pay for college tuition or health insurance, or actually it might." Jack had been saving the most compelling argument for last. He pulled out documentation he'd printed from online auction sites, showing recent sales prices for Civil War-era gold coins and historical artifacts. "Sarah, those 37 coins we found yesterday, at current market prices, they're worth more than $400,000. And that's just the first cache. Thomas's note suggests there are many more hiding places on the property." Sarah's expression shifted from skepticism to calculation. $400,000 was serious money, the kind of money that could secure Tommy's education and eliminate Jack's financial problems. "You're sure these coins are authentic?" "I'm having them appraised next week. But Martha Henley, she's a local historian who's been helping with research. She's confident they're genuine. And you think there are more?" Jack pulled out the compass, watching Sarah's reaction as the needle spun away from magnetic north to point steadily toward the barn. "This compass has been guiding us from one discovery to the next. Thomas designed it to help his descendants find what he hid. We've barely begun to explore the possibilities." Sarah held the compass, frowning as she tried to understand its unusual behavior. Despite her urban sophistication, she'd grown up on her grandparents' farm and understood that old rural properties often held surprises. "Jack, assuming all of this is true, assuming you really have found valuable historical artifacts, what's your plan? You can't just keep them in a coffee can in the barn. I've been thinking about that. First, we document everything properly. We work with legitimate historians and archaeologists to make sure the finds are recorded and preserved. Then we decide what can be sold to secure Tommy's future and what needs to be donated to museums or historical societies." That sounds reasonable in theory, but what about the practical issues? Tommy's education, his social development, his connection to something meaningful. Jack's voice carried more conviction than he'd felt in months. "Sarah, when was the last time you saw Tommy genuinely excited about anything? Not video games, not movies, not shopping for new clothes. I mean really excited about learning something, discovering something, being part of something important. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. He did seem different on the phone last night, more engaged. He's proud of what we're doing. He's proud of his family history. And he's learning skills he'll never get from textbooks. Research, problem-solving, critical thinking. Understanding that the world is full of mysteries waiting to be solved. The sound of the school bus interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they watched Tommy hop down from the bus and jog toward the farmhouse, his backpack bouncing with each step. His face lit up when he saw his mother's car. "Mom!" Tommy burst through the kitchen door with the enthusiasm of someone who had exciting news to share. "Did Dad show you the treasure? Did he tell you about the compass and the Underground Railroad and everything?" Sarah's expression softened as she looked at her son. Tommy's clothes were indeed dirty, and he'd obviously been working with his hands. But his eyes were bright with intelligence and purpose in a way she hadn't seen since before the divorce. "He showed me some very interesting historical documents," Sarah said carefully. "It's not just documents, Mom. It's real treasure, hidden by my great-great-great-grandfather to help escaped slaves. And there's way more still buried around here." Dad says I'm a natural archaeologist. Jack watched Sarah's face as she processed Tommy's excitement. This wasn't the sullen, withdrawn boy who'd been shuffled between households during the divorce proceedings. This was a confident young man who'd found something worth caring about. "Tommy, go wash your hands and change your clothes," Sarah said. "I want to talk to your father privately." After Tommy disappeared upstairs, Sarah turned to Jack with an expression he couldn't quite read. "He really is different. More mature somehow. He's found his purpose. And Sarah, I think I've found mine too. Not just the treasure hunting, but preserving this family legacy. Making sure the people who trusted Thomas Rourke with their lives get the recognition they deserve." Sarah walked around the kitchen, examining the historical documents more carefully. "Jack, I'm not saying no, but I need guarantees. I need to know that Tommy's getting proper nutrition, proper education, proper medical care. I need to know that this isn't just some midlife crisis disguised as historical preservation." "What kind of guarantees?" "First, you get those coins appraised by a certified expert, not some local antique dealer, a legitimate numismatist with credentials. Second, you establish a trust fund for Tommy's education with a significant portion of whatever you find. Third, you work with accredited historians and archaeologists, not just enthusiastic amateurs." Jack felt a surge of hope. Sarah wasn't demanding that Tommy return to Columbus immediately. She was negotiating terms for him to stay. "And fourth," Sarah continued, "I want to be involved. Not living here, but consulted on major decisions. If you're going to turn our son into an archaeologist, I want to make sure it's done properly." "You mean it? You'll let Tommy stay?" "I mean, I'll give you 6 months to prove this isn't a fantasy. 6 months to show me that you can provide stability and security while pursuing these historical discoveries." "But Jack, if things go badly, if Tommy's grades suffer or his health suffers or he gets hurt playing treasure hunter, I'm taking him back to Columbus immediately." Jack felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. 6 months wasn't forever, but it was time enough to prove that their adventure was legitimate and valuable. "Thank you." "Sarah, you won't regret this. I better not." Sarah's expression grew serious. "And Jack, be careful. If there really is valuable treasure hidden on this property, and if other people know about it, you and Tommy could be in real danger." As if summoned by her words, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. 3 men in expensive suits emerged, looking around the property with the careful attention of people, conducting surveillance rather than making a casual visit. Jack's stomach tightened as he recognized the business. Card Martha had shown him that morning. Blackstone Historical Acquisitions had found them. Jack Rourke. The lead man approached the kitchen door with confidence that suggested he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. "My name is Marcus Webb. I represent certain parties who are very interested in discussing the historical significance of your property." Through the kitchen window, Jack could see that the man's companions weren't examining the farmhouse or barn with academic interest. They were studying the property with the professional assessment of people who knew how to find things that other people wanted to keep hidden. Sarah moved closer to Jack, her maternal instincts overriding their marital problems. "Who are these people?" "People who want what we found," Jack said quietly. "People who've been waiting a long time to get access to this property." Marcus Webb knocked on the door with the patient persistence of someone who understood that evasion was futile. "Mr. Rourke, we know you've made some interesting discoveries recently. We'd very much like to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement." Jack looked at Sarah, at the historical documents spread across their kitchen table, at the stairs where Tommy was presumably changing clothes and dreaming about their next archaeological adventure. The treasure hunt had attracted exactly the kind of attention Martha had warned him about. Now he had to decide whether to trust strangers with expensive cars and professional smiles, or to protect his family's legacy with resources he didn't have and skills he was still learning. "Sarah, take Tommy out the back door," Jack said quietly. "Go to Martha Henley's house and stay there until I call you." "What about you?" "I'm going to find out exactly what these people want and exactly how much they know about what we've found." Jack walked to the front door, his hand briefly touching the compass in his pocket. Thomas Rourke had hidden his secrets well enough to protect them for more than a century. Now it was Jack's turn to prove he was worthy of the family legacy. Marcus Webb stepped into the farmhouse kitchen with the confident familiarity of someone who'd been planning this visit for years. His colleagues remained outside, their positions carefully chosen to observe all approaches to the property. "Mr. Rourke, thank you for agreeing to speak with us," Webb said, though Jack hadn't actually agreed to anything. "I think you'll find our conversation quite illuminating." Webb was younger than Jack had expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested expensive education and serious financial backing. But his eyes held the calculating intelligence of someone accustomed to complex negotiations. "What exactly do you want?" Jack asked, remaining standing. "To maintain whatever psychological advantage he could. We want to help you understand the full scope of what you've inherited." Webb gestured toward the historical documents, still spread across the kitchen table. "May I?" Without waiting for permission, Webb examined the materials with obvious expertise. His fingers lingered on Martha's photographs and maps, suggesting familiarity with the subject matter that went far beyond casual interest. "Impressive research," Webb said finally. Though not entirely complete, from his briefcase, Webb withdrew a folder thick with documents. "Mr. Rourke, what has your research told you about your father's business activities during the 1980s? The question caught Jack off guard. "My father was a farmer. He ran a small agricultural operation." Webb smiled, with the patient condescension of someone delivering unwelcome news. "Your father was much more than that. He was an inventor, an entrepreneur, and ultimately the victim of one of the most sophisticated intellectual property thefts in agricultural history." Webb spread his own documents across the table. Patent applications, business correspondence, and what appeared to be legal contracts. Robert Rourke developed revolutionary farming equipment in the early 1980s, automated systems that could increase crop yields by 30% while reducing water usage by half. Technology that's now the foundation of a multi-billion-dollar agricultural empire. Jack stared at the patent applications, his father's name clearly visible as the original inventor. "I don't understand. My father never had any money. He lived like a man who'd been systematically cheated out of his life's work." Webb's voice carried genuine sympathy. "Your father entered into a business partnership with Meridian Agricultural Systems in 1985. They were supposed to help him develop and market his inventions." Webb pulled out a photograph of two men shaking hands in front of a corporate logo. Jack recognized his father immediately, though Robert looked younger and more hopeful than Jack remembered him ever being. "The man beside your father is James Blackstone, founder and CEO of what's now one of the largest agricultural corporations in North America." In 1985, he was a smooth-talking venture capitalist who specialized in acquiring patents from small inventors. Blackstone, as in Blackstone Historical Acquisitions, James Blackstone's son. The family business has evolved over the years. Jack felt his world shifting beneath him. His father hadn't been a failure, he'd been robbed. The bitterness, the drinking, the isolation that had defined Robert Rourke's later years suddenly made terrible sense. What happened to the partnership? Webb's expression grew grim. Meridian claimed that Robert had failed to fulfill his contractual obligations. They said his prototypes didn't work, that his research was incomplete, that he'd essentially defrauded them. They took control of all his patents and intellectual property, then used that technology to build an agricultural empire worth billions. But that's theft. It's business. Robert signed contracts he didn't fully understand, trusting people who saw him as nothing more than a source of valuable ideas. By the time he realized what had happened, Meridian had the resources to tie him up in legal battles he couldn't afford to fight. Jack thought about his father's journal entries, about references to fighting powerful, well-connected enemies. He did fight, though. He spent years trying to prove the patents were stolen. He did indeed, and he was remarkably successful, considering the odds against him. Webb pulled out another set of documents. In 1999, Robert finally gathered enough evidence to file a substantial lawsuit against Meridian. He had documentation proving that his original designs were functional, that Meridian had used his technology without authorization, and that they deliberately destroyed his reputation to cover their theft. What happened to the lawsuit? Your father won. Quietly, and with a confidentiality agreement that prevented him from discussing the settlement publicly. But Mr. Rourke, the settlement was for $200 million. Jack stared at Webb, certain he'd misheard. $200 million? $200 million, awarded to Robert Michael Rourke in March 2000. Payment was structured as an annuity, with monthly installments designed to provide him with substantial income for the rest of his life. Jack's mind reeled. His father, the man he'd remembered as a bitter failure who drank too much and accomplished too little, had been secretly wealthy for the last decade of his life. Where's the money? That's where things become interesting. Webb's smile suggested he'd been anticipating this question. Your father never claimed a single payment. The settlement has been sitting in escrow for over 20 years, accumulating interest and investment returns. The current value is approximately $400 million. Jack felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. $400 million. His father had died rich enough to buy half the county, but had lived like a man who could barely afford groceries. Why didn't he take the money? According to our research, Robert was terrified that accepting the settlement would somehow invalidate his claims or expose him to retaliation from Meridian. He'd spent 15 years fighting them, and he didn't trust that they wouldn't find a way to reverse the judgment. Webb pulled out a final document. A bank-safe deposit box key attached to a receipt dated just 3 months before Robert's death, but he did prepare for the inheritance to pass to you. This key opens a safe deposit box at First National Bank in Columbus. Inside that box, you'll find all the documentation necessary to claim the settlement funds, plus instructions Robert left for handling the legal and financial complexities. Jack stared at the key, feeling the weight of revelation settling over him. His father hadn't abandoned him, he'd been protecting him. The distance, the silence, the apparent poverty had all been part of an elaborate deception designed to keep him safe from the people who'd already destroyed Robert's life once. Why are you telling me this? Jack asked. What do you want in return? We want to make you an offer. Blackstone Historical Acquisitions is prepared to purchase your father's settlement rights for $300 million, cash, immediately available. You'd retain full ownership of this property and anything you find on it, but you'd be free of the legal complications that come with challenging a major corporation. $300 million. But you said the settlement is worth $400 million. The settlement is worth $400 million if you can successfully claim it. But Mr. Rourke, Meridian Agricultural Systems, now called Blackstone Industries, is still a very powerful corporation with enormous legal resources. They've spent 20 years preparing to contest your father's settlement if anyone ever tried to claim it. Webb's expression grew serious. They know about the Underground Railroad artifacts you've found. They know about the gold coins and the historical significance of this property. And they know that a man fighting for his family's treasure might be motivated to pursue legal battles he can't afford to lose. Jack felt the trap closing around him. You're saying they'll use the treasure hunt against me in court? I'm saying they'll argue that you're a desperate treasure hunter who discovered some old coins and convinced yourself that your father was secretly wealthy. They'll say you're trying to defraud their corporation based on fantasies and delusions. Jack looked at the safe deposit box key, then at the patent documents that proved his father had been a brilliant inventor rather than a failed farmer. What happens if I don't accept your offer? Then you'll spend years in legal battles that will cost more than most people make in a lifetime. You'll be fighting a corporation that has unlimited resources and no moral constraints. And even if you eventually win, the stress and expense might destroy your relationship with your son and your chance for a normal life. Webb stood, signaling that the negotiation phase of their conversation was ending. Mr. Rourke, I'm not the villain in this story. My family didn't steal your father's patents. We're the people trying to help you recover what was taken from him. $300 million is more money than you could spend in several lifetimes. It's enough to secure your son's future and honor your father's legacy without risking everything. In legal battles, you might not survive, Jack. Walked to the window and looked out at the barn where Tommy was probably still, thinking about their next archaeological adventure. His son had found purpose and excitement in their treasure hunt, but Webb was offering security beyond anything Jack had ever imagined. I need time to think about this, of course. But Mr. Rourke, understand that our offer has a limited time frame. The parties are aware of your father's settlement, and they may not be as generous as we are. Webb handed Jack a business card with a phone number written on the back. Call me when you've made your decision. And Mr. Rourke, for your family's sake, don't wait too long. As Webb and his colleagues drove away, Jack stood in his kitchen holding the safe deposit box key and trying to process the magnitude of what he'd learned. His father hadn't been a failure. He'd been a victim who'd fought back and won. The money was real, the settlement was legitimate, and Tommy's future could be secured with a single phone call. But accepting Webb's offer would mean abandoning the treasure hunt that had given Tommy such joy. It would mean walking away from Thomas Rourke's legacy and the historical artifacts that deserved to be properly preserved and displayed. Most importantly, it would mean trusting people whose motivations Jack didn't fully understand and whose connection to the original theft remained unclear. Jack opened the compass and watched the needle point steadily toward the barn. Thomas Rourke had hidden his treasures well enough to protect them for over a century. Robert Rourke had fought against impossible odds and won a victory he'd been too afraid to claim. Now it was Jack's turn to decide whether to continue the family tradition of protecting their legacy, or to take the safe path and trust strangers with expensive cars and questionable motives. The phone rang, interrupting his contemplation. Sarah's voice was tight with anxiety when he answered. "Jack, are you okay? Those men left about 10 minutes ago, and they looked like they got what they came for." "They got something," Jack said. "But I'm not sure it's what they expected." "What do you mean?" Jack looked at the safe deposit box key, at the patent documents proving his father's genius, at the historical materials that had started their entire adventure. "I mean, we're not just treasure hunters anymore, Sarah. We're heirs to something much bigger than buried gold coins. And I need to decide whether we're brave enough to claim our full inheritance." The drive to Columbus took 2 hours, giving Jack plenty of time to question every decision that had brought him to this moment. Tommy sat beside him, alternating between excitement about visiting the bank vault and concern about leaving their treasure hunt unfinished. "Dad, what if someone else finds the other caches while we're gone?" Tommy asked as they navigated downtown traffic. Then we'll deal with it when we get back. Jack's voice carried more confidence than he felt. But Tommy, what we're doing today might be more important than anything we could dig up from the ground. The safe deposit box key felt heavy in Jack's pocket, weighted with the promise of answers that could change everything. Sarah had insisted on coming with them, her legal training making her essential for interpreting whatever documents they might find. First National Bank occupied an entire city block, its stone facade radiating the kind of institutional permanence that suggested they'd been guarding secrets since before the Civil War. The safe deposit box department was located in the basement, behind multiple layers of security that made Jack understand why his father had considered it the safest place to hide his most important documents. Box 347, Jack told the attendant, producing both the key and identification documents that proved his relationship to Robert Rourke. The attendant, a middle-aged woman with the careful demeanor of someone who'd seen plenty of family dramas play out in the vault, led them through a series of locked doors to a room lined with numbered metal boxes. "Take all the time you need," she said, producing the bank's key and opening the box alongside Jack's. "I'll be at the desk outside when you're finished." Jack's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the metal container from its slot. It was heavier than expected, suggesting substantial contents beyond simple paperwork. They carried the box to a private viewing room, where Sarah spread clean towels across the table to protect whatever they might find. Jack opened the lid slowly, conscious that he might be the first person other than his father to see its contents. The box was meticulously organized, with documents arranged in labeled folders that told the story of Robert Rourke's secret legal victory. The settlement agreement alone was 40 pages of dense legal language, but the essential facts were clear. Meridian Agricultural Systems had agreed to pay $200 million in damages for patent infringement, with the total growing to $400 million through accumulated interest and investment returns. "This is real," Sarah whispered, examining the bank statements that documented the settlement account's steady growth over 20 years. "Jack, your father was secretly worth more than most small countries. But it was the personal letter at the bottom of the box that made Jack understand the true cost of his father's victory. Written in Robert's careful handwriting, it was addressed to "My son Jack. If you're reading this, Jack, if you found this box, it means I'm gone, and you finally learned the truth about what happened to our family. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I'm sorry I let you think I was a failure when the real failure was my inability to trust anyone, including you, with the truth. The money is yours now, all of it, free and clear. The legal documents will show you how to claim it. But before you do, I need you to understand why I never touched a penny of that settlement. Meridian, now called Blackstone Industries, didn't just steal my patents. They destroyed my reputation, turned my friends against me, and made me afraid to trust my own shadow. When I finally won the lawsuit, I was terrified that they'd find a way to take it back, or worse, that they'd come after you to get revenge. So I lived like a poor man and died like one. But I made sure the money would be safe for you and your children. Every month for 20 years, I let those settlement payments accumulate, knowing that someday you'd have resources they could never touch. But Jack, the money isn't the real treasure. The real treasure is what Thomas left hidden on our land. Those artifacts, those personal belongings of people brave enough to risk everything for freedom, they're worth more than gold. They're proof that our family has always stood for something important. Use the money wisely. Protect the artifacts properly. And never let anyone convince you that our family legacy is for sale. With love and regret, your father Jack read the letter twice, feeling a mixture of gratitude and grief that made it hard to breathe. His father had sacrificed his own comfort and happiness to ensure that the family legacy remained intact. Tommy leaned against Jack's shoulder, reading over the letter with the solemn concentration of someone trying to understand adult complexities. "Grandpa was protecting us," Tommy said quietly. Even when we didn't know we needed protecting, Sarah was examining the financial documents with her lawyer's eye for detail. Jack, this is legitimate. The settlement is real, the account is fully funded, and the legal documentation appears to be ironclad. But, Jack could hear the reservation in her voice, but your father was right to be cautious. Claiming this money will almost certainly trigger a legal challenge from Blackstone Industries. They've had 20 years to prepare for this moment, and they'll throw everything they have at you to avoid paying. Jack thought about Marcus Webb's offer of $300 million with no legal complications. It was starting to look less generous and more like extortion. What do you think our chances are if we fight them in court? With documentation this thorough? Very good eventually. But eventually could be years, and the legal costs could be enormous. Tommy had been quietly examining the other contents of the safe deposit box while Jack and Sarah discussed legal strategy. Now he held up a small metal object that made Jack's breath catch. "Dad, is this another compass?" It was indeed another compass, similar to the one they'd been using for their treasure hunt, but clearly newer and more sophisticated. This one was made from silver rather than brass, with more precise calibration marks around the perimeter. "There's a note attached," Tommy said, unfolding a small piece of paper. The note was in Robert's handwriting. "For the final cash. When you're ready to claim everything Thomas left behind." Jack took the silver compass and watched as its needle spun wildly before settling on a bearing that was completely different from the brass compass they'd been following. "Two compasses," Sarah said slowly. "Two different treasure hunts. Or two different stages of the same hunt," Jack corrected. "Maybe Thomas designed a system where you had to find the first caches before you could locate the final one." The implications were staggering. If Thomas Rourke had hidden his most valuable treasures in a final cache that could only be found after completing the preliminary searches, then everything they'd discovered so far was just preparation for something much more significant. "Dad," Tommy said with growing excitement, "what if the real treasure isn't the gold coins we found? What if those were just the test to see if we were worthy of finding what Thomas really wanted to protect?" Jack looked at his son's eager face, at the silver compass pointing towards secrets that had waited more than a century to be revealed, at the legal documents that proved his father had won a victory he'd been too afraid to claim. Marcus Webb had offered them $300 million to walk away from their legacy. Robert Rourke had left them $400 million to protect it properly, but Thomas Rourke might have left them something that was priceless in ways that had nothing to do with money. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. If we go back to the farm and follow this compass to whatever Thomas hid in his final cache, are you willing to support that decision, even if it means turning down $300 million in guaranteed money?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the compass and the legal documents and the letter from Robert that explained 20 years of sacrifice and secrecy. "Jack, a week ago I thought you were having a midlife crisis. Today I find out that your father was secretly wealthy and your great-great-great-grandfather was hiding Civil War treasures and Underground Railroad artifacts. That's not really an answer." Sarah smiled, the first genuinely warm smile Jack had seen from her since before their divorce. "It's not an answer because I don't have one yet. But I know this. Tommy is happier than I've seen him in 2 years. You're more focused and determined than you've been since we were first married. And your father spent his entire life protecting something he believed was more important than money." She picked up the silver compass, watching the needle point steadily toward some distant goal. "So yes, I'll support whatever decision you make. But Jack, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. We're going to document everything, work with legitimate experts, and make sure that whatever we find gets the respect and protection it deserves." Tommy let out a whoop of excitement that echoed through the bank vault's stone walls. "So we're really going to find the final treasure?" Jack gathered the documents and carefully returned them to the safe deposit box, keeping only the silver compass and his father's letter. The settlement money would wait. It had been waiting for 20 years already, and it could wait a little longer. "We're going to find whatever Thomas Rourke wanted his family to find," Jack said. "And we're going to make sure the people who trusted him with their most precious belongings get the recognition they deserve." As they drove back toward the farm, Jack felt a sense of purpose that went beyond treasure hunting or financial security. They weren't just following compass bearings toward buried caches. They were completing a mission that had been passed down through 5 generations of the Rourke family. The final cache was waiting, and with it, answers to questions that had haunted his family for more than a century. But first, they had to get past Marcus Webb and his colleagues, who were almost certainly watching the farm and waiting for Jack to make his decision about their offer. The real treasure hunt was about to begin, and this time the stakes were higher than gold coins or historical artifacts. This time they were fighting for the right to complete their family's destiny. The black sedan was parked at the end of their driveway when they returned from Columbus, positioned where its occupants could observe all approaches to the property. Jack felt his stomach tighten as he recognized Marcus Webb in the passenger seat, apparently waiting with the patience of someone who understood that pressure applied steadily was more effective than dramatic confrontation. "Dad, those are the same guys from yesterday," Tommy said, instinctively moving closer to Jack as they got out of the truck. "I know. Stay close to me and let me do the talking." Webb emerged from the sedan with the same confident smile he'd worn during their previous encounter, but Jack noticed that his colleagues remained in the vehicle this time, their positions carefully chosen to observe without appearing threatening. "Mr. Rourke," Webb called out as they approached the farmhouse, "I hope your trip to Columbus was productive." The comment confirmed Jack's suspicion that Webb's organization had been monitoring their activities. The knowledge was both unsettling and somehow reassuring. If they were being watched this closely, it meant their discoveries were even more significant than he'd realized. "What do you want, Webb?" "I want to know whether you've had time to consider our offer." $300 million. Mr. Rourke, enough to secure your family's future without the complications that come with challenging major corporations. Jack felt the weight of the silver compass in his pocket, pointing towards secrets that Webb clearly knew nothing about. "What if I told you that our research has uncovered additional complications that make your offer less attractive?" Webb's smile faltered slightly. "What kind of complications?" "The kind that suggest your family's involvement in this situation goes back further than you originally claimed." It was a bluff, but Webb's reaction confirmed that Jack was on the right track. The younger man's professional composure cracked, just enough to reveal genuine concern. "Mr. Rourke, I think we should discuss this privately. Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of my family." Webb glanced toward the sedan, where his colleagues waited with the alert posture of people prepared for complications. When he spoke again, his voice carried less charm and more urgency. "Very well. You're right that my family's connection to this situation predates our current business relationship. My grandfather was involved in the original partnership with your father, and yes, that relationship ended badly for everyone involved. Your grandfather stole my father's patents. My grandfather was a businessman who made business decisions based on legal contracts that your father signed. Willingly." Webb's voice hardened. "But Mr. Rourke, that's ancient history. What matters now is that you have an opportunity to recover more money than your father ever imagined, without the risks that come with fighting corporations that have unlimited legal resources." Tommy stepped forward with the fearless curiosity of a 12-year-old who'd spent the week discovering that adults weren't as smart as they pretended to be. "If you want to help us, why are you trying to stop us from finding the rest of the treasure?" Webb's attention shifted to Tommy with obvious surprise. "I'm not trying to stop you from anything, young man. I'm trying to protect your family from legal battles that could destroy your lives." "But we found proof that Grandpa already won his legal battle," Tommy continued. "And we found another compass that points to something way cooler than money." Jack felt a surge of pride at his son's courage. Even as he wished Tommy hadn't revealed quite so much information, Webb's expression grew very serious. Another compass? Before Jack could stop him, Tommy pulled out the silver compass and held it up for Webb to see. The needle immediately began spinning, eventually settling on a bearing that pointed directly toward the northeastern section of the property. "It's different from the brass one," Tommy explained with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a fascinating discovery. "Dad thinks Thomas designed a two-stage treasure hunt, where you had to find the easy stuff before you could find the really important stuff." Webb stared at the silver compass with obvious recognition. His professional composure completely abandoned. "Mr. Rourke, where exactly did you find that compass? Why, do you recognize it?" Webb walked back toward his sedan without answering, returning with a leather portfolio that he opened to reveal historical documents and photographs. "This photograph was taken in 1865, Webb said, holding up an image that made Jack's breath catch. The photograph showed Thomas Rourke standing beside a Union Army officer, both men holding identical silver compasses. In the background was the barn, but it looked different, newer, with additional structures that had long since disappeared. "Your great-great-great-grandfather wasn't just hiding treasure for escaped slaves," Webb continued. "He was the official custodian for a Union Army payroll shipment worth $50 million in 1865 currency. That would be worth more than $1 billion today." Jack felt the world shift around him. $1 billion? The Union Army was moving gold reserves to Canada for safekeeping near the end of the war. Thomas Rourke was contracted to hide the shipment temporarily while Confederate raiders were active in the area. But the war ended before the gold could be retrieved, and the Army decided it was safer to leave it hidden than to transport it through territories that were still unsettled. Webb pointed to the silver compass in Tommy's hands. That compass was designed by Union Army engineers to work in conjunction with magnetic anomalies they created around the burial site. It only functions properly within a certain radius of the cache, and it only points to the correct location when activated by someone with the right genetic markers. Genetic markers. Thomas Rourke's descendants? The compass was calibrated to respond to his family's specific bioelectric signature, something to do with blood chemistry that the Army's scientists didn't fully understand but knew they could replicate. Tommy held up the compass, watching the needle spin toward its consistent northeastern bearing. "So this only works because we're related to Thomas?" "That's correct. And Mr. Rourke, that means you're the only people alive who can find the final cache." Jack understood now why Webb had been so eager to make a deal. Blackstone Industries didn't just want to avoid paying the settlement. They wanted access to a treasure worth more than their entire corporation. "Which brings us back to our original offer," Webb continued. $300 million, plus we handle all the excavation and recovery of the Union gold. You retain ownership of your father's historical artifacts. We handle the complications that come with finding government treasure. What happens to the Union gold? It gets returned to its rightful owners, the federal government, with appropriate finder's fees and historical preservation considerations. Sarah stepped forward with the careful tone of someone who'd spent her career detecting deception in legal proceedings. "Mr. Webb, you've been very forthcoming about the historical significance of this property, but you haven't explained why your organization is qualified to handle federal treasure recovery, or why the government would work through private contractors rather than their own agencies." Webb's confident smile returned, but it looked forced now, like a mask that didn't quite fit properly. "Miss Patterson, Blackstone Historical Acquisitions has extensive experience with government contracts and archaeological recovery projects. We have the resources and expertise to handle this situation properly. I'm sure you do. But I'm curious about something else. If this treasure is legitimate government property, why haven't federal agencies been involved in the search? Why has this remained a private family matter for more than a century?" Webb was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Jack's family and the sedan where his colleagues waited. "Because officially, the treasure doesn't exist. The Army's records from that period were incomplete, and there's no documentation proving that the gold was ever delivered to Thomas Rourke. But you have documentation, Jack said. You have photographs and historical evidence that proves the cash exists. We have evidence that suggests its existence. But legal ownership would be complicated, Jack understood now. The Union gold existed, but its legal status was ambiguous, enough that whoever found it might be able to claim ownership. Through salvage rights or historical precedent, Webb wasn't offering to help them recover government property. He was offering to help them steal it. Legally, Tommy, Jack said quietly. Go into the house and call Martha Henley. Tell her we need her help with some historical research. But, Dad, I want to... Now, Tommy. As his son reluctantly walked toward the farmhouse, Jack turned back to Webb with a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff. Mr. Webb, I appreciate your offer, but we're going to handle this ourselves. We're going to find Thomas Rourke's final cache. We're going to document everything we discover, and we're going to make sure it's handled according to proper archaeological and legal standards. Webb's mask of professional courtesy finally slipped completely. Mr. Rourke, you're making a serious mistake. You don't have the resources or expertise to handle a discovery of this magnitude, and you certainly don't have the legal protection you'll need when word gets out about what you found. Are you threatening us? I'm warning you, this property has been watched by various interested parties for decades. If you insist on proceeding without professional guidance, you may find that your family's safety becomes a concern. Sarah moved closer to Jack, her protective instincts overriding any fear she might have felt. Mr. Webb, I think this conversation is over. If you have legitimate business to discuss, you can contact our attorney. Webb looked around the property one more time, his eyes lingering on the barn and the northeastern section where the silver compass pointed. You have 48 hours to reconsider, he said finally. After that, other interested parties may become involved, and their offers may be considerably less generous than ours. As Webb and his colleagues drove away, Jack stood in his farmyard, holding a compass that could lead them to $1 billion treasure. Surrounded by family who'd chosen adventure over security, the real treasure hunt was about to begin. And this time, they'd be racing against opponents who had unlimited resources and questionable ethics. But they had something Webb's organization lacked. They had the right to be here, the knowledge passed down through generations, and the courage to see their family legacy through to its conclusion. The silver compass pointed steadily northeast, towards secrets that had waited more than a century for the right people to find them. Martha Henley arrived within an hour, her sedan followed by a pickup truck carrying two men Jack didn't recognize. As the vehicles parked in the farmyard, Martha emerged with the determined expression of someone who'd made important decisions during her drive over. Jack, these are my nephews, David and Michael. They're archaeologists from Ohio State, and they've been waiting 30 years for someone to give them permission to properly excavate this property. The two men were in their 40s, with the weathered hands and careful eyes of people who'd spent their careers uncovering buried secrets. They carried equipment that looked considerably more sophisticated than Jack's borrowed metal detector and basic digging tools. Mrs. Henley filled us in on the situation during the drive, David said, extending his hand. If you're serious about doing this properly, we're here to help. Properly means documenting everything, following archaeological protocols, and making sure that whatever we find gets the legal protection it deserves, Michael added. It also means being prepared for complications, because discoveries of this magnitude always attract attention from people with their own agendas. Jack felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Professional help would be invaluable, but it also meant that their family treasure hunt was becoming a serious archaeological expedition with implications he wasn't sure he was ready for. Before we start digging, Martha said, there's something else you need to know. I made some phone calls after you left for Columbus yesterday. The local sheriff, the State Archaeological Commission, and a contact I have at the National Archives. What did you find out? I found out that Marcus Webb was lying about several important things. First, there are federal records documenting the Union Army payroll shipment he mentioned. Second, those records show that the gold was never officially recovered, which means it's still legally government property. And third, Blackstone Historical. Acquisitions doesn't have any legitimate government. Contracts for treasure recovery. Sarah stepped forward with the sharp attention of someone hearing evidence that could change everything. What does that mean legally? It means that if you find Union Army gold on this property, you'll be required to report it to federal authorities, Martha continued. But it also means you may be entitled to a substantial finder's fee, potentially 25% of the recovered value. Jack did quick mental math. 25% of $1 billion was still more money than his family could spend in several lifetimes. But more importantly, Martha added, it means that whatever Thomas hid in conjunction with the government gold, the personal artifacts, the Underground Railroad materials, the family treasures, those items would legally belong to you as the property owner. Tommy appeared in the farmhouse doorway. Having apparently been listening to the conversation from inside, so we can keep the important stuff and split the money with the government? He asked. That's a simplified way to put it, David said, but essentially accurate. The question is whether you're prepared to handle a discovery that will inevitably attract national attention. Jack looked around the farmyard at the assembled group. His ex-wife, his son, an elderly historian, and 2 professional archaeologists. A week ago, he'd been a failed insurance salesman hiding from bill collectors in a falling-down farmhouse. Now he was potentially hours away from uncovering one of the most significant treasure finds in American history. Let's do it properly, Jack said. But let's do it quickly. Webb gave us 48 hours before his organization involves other parties. And I don't think we want to find out what that means. The silver compass led them to a location about 50 yards northeast of the barn, in an area that had been overgrown with blackberry bushes for decades. As David and Michael cleared the vegetation with professional efficiency, Jack began to understand why the site had remained hidden for so long. Look at this, Michael called out, pointing to stones that Jack had assumed were random field rocks. These aren't natural formations. They're deliberately placed markers. When the area was fully cleared, the markers formed a perfect circle about 12 feet in diameter. At the center of the circle, barely visible beneath decades of accumulated soil, was a stone slab with symbols carved into its surface. Thomas was more sophisticated than we realized, Martha said, examining the carved symbols. These markings are consistent with Union Army engineering codes from the 1860s. David had been running a ground-penetrating radar unit over the site, and his readings confirmed what the compass had been telling them. There's definitely a substantial artificial structure about 8 feet down, he reported. Rectangular, maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, constructed from fitted stone blocks. A vault, Sarah said quietly. A professionally constructed vault, Michael corrected. This wasn't some farmer digging a hole in his backyard. This was a military engineering project designed to protect valuable materials for decades or centuries. The excavation took 3 hours of careful work. Unlike their previous amateur digging, this was systematic archaeological recovery, with every layer of soil documented and every artifact carefully catalogued. As they worked deeper, the scope of Thomas Rourke's secret became clear. The vault was indeed professionally constructed, with fitted granite blocks and a drainage system that had kept the interior dry for more than a century. When they finally reached the vault's sealed entrance, Jack felt the weight of 5 generations of family history settling on his shoulders. Before we open this, Martha said, everyone needs to understand that what we find inside will change your lives permanently. There's no going back to anonymous treasure hunting after this. Jack looked at Tommy, who was practically vibrating with excitement despite the serious tone of the conversation. Are you ready for that, son? Are you ready for people to know that we're the family who found the Union Army gold? Tommy grinned with the fearless enthusiasm of someone who'd spent his entire life dreaming of adventures like this one. Dad, We've been ready for this our whole lives. We just didn't know it yet. Jack nodded to David, who began the careful process of removing the vault's seal. The stone slab was heavy enough to require mechanical assistance, but when it finally moved aside, it revealed a chamber that took everyone's breath away. The vault was larger than expected, with walls lined with wooden shelves and storage containers. But what dominated the space was a collection of metal strongboxes, each one bearing official Union Army markings and seals that had remained intact for more than a century. "My God," Michael whispered. "It's all here." Jack climbed into the vault with careful reverence, aware that he might be the first person to enter the space since Thomas Rourke had sealed it in 1865. The air was dry and clean, preserved by the same engineering that had kept moisture away from the contents. The strong boxes were too heavy to lift alone, but when Jack opened the first one, the contents made everyone understand why Webb had been so desperate to make a deal. Gold coins filled the box to capacity, not the few dozen pieces they'd found in the previous cache, but thousands of coins representing the Union Army's entire payroll reserve for the Western Territories. "There must be 20 boxes down here," Jack called up to the others. "Maybe more." But as he explored the vault more thoroughly, Jack realized that the gold was only part of Thomas Rourke's legacy. The walls were lined with carefully preserved personal items, photographs, letters, jewelry, and other precious belongings that escaped slaves had entrusted to the Underground Railroad network. In the far corner of the vault, Jack found what appeared to be Thomas's personal collection, documents, maps, and artifacts that told the story of a man who'd risked everything to help others achieve freedom. And at the very center of the vault, displayed with obvious reverence, was a simple wooden sign that had clearly hung above the entrance to the original barn. The sign read, "Rourke Farm, All Souls Welcome." Jack felt tears in his eyes as he understood the full meaning of his great-great-great-grandfather's legacy. Thomas hadn't just been hiding treasure. He'd been preserving the evidence of courage, sacrifice, and human dignity that deserved to be remembered forever. "Dad, are you okay?" Tommy called down into the vault. "I'm better than okay, son. I'm proud. Proud of our family, proud of what we've found, and proud that we're the ones who get to make sure this story is told properly." As Jack climbed out of the vault, he saw that the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the farmyard. They'd been working for hours, but it felt like minutes, and somewhere in the distance, he could see dust clouds that suggested vehicles were approaching on the county road. Webb had said 48 hours, but it appeared that other interested parties had decided not to wait for the deadline. The treasure was found, but the real battle for the Rourke family legacy was just beginning. 6 months later, Jack stood in the same spot where they'd uncovered Thomas Rourke's vault, but the farmyard looked completely different. The barn had been professionally restored to its 1865 appearance, its red paint gleaming in the spring sunshine. A small parking area accommodated the steady stream of visitors who came to see the Rourke Underground Railroad Museum and historical site. The legal battles had been resolved more quickly than anyone had expected. Federal authorities, faced with meticulous archaeological documentation and clear evidence of the Rourke family's historical role as government contractors, had awarded them the maximum finder's fee, 25% of the recovered gold's value. The personal artifacts and family treasures remained their property, forming the foundation of a museum collection that attracted historians from around the world. Marcus Webb had disappeared shortly after news of the discovery became public. His organization's questionable claims, exposed by federal investigators who took a dim view of private companies attempting to claim government treasure through intimidation and fraud. "Dad, the tour group from the university is here," Tommy called from the museum's entrance. At 13, Tommy had grown 3 inches and developed the confident bearing of someone who'd discovered that his family history was worth preserving and sharing. He'd become the museum's youngest volunteer guide, capable of explaining the complex relationships between the Underground Railroad, Civil War logistics, and archaeological preservation with an expertise that impressed visiting scholars. Jack walked toward the museum entrance, passing the restored sign that now hung in a place of honor above the main door. Rourke Farm, all souls welcome. The words meant even more now that they understood the full scope of Thomas Rourke's courage and compassion. Inside the museum, display cases held the personal artifacts that had been hidden for more than a century. Photographs of families separated by slavery but united by hope. Letters that spoke of determination and love. Jewelry and keepsakes that represented everything people had been willing to risk for freedom. But the centerpiece of the museum was the vault itself, now accessible by a carefully constructed stairway and climate-controlled to preserve its contents for future generations. Visitors could see exactly how Thomas had arranged his hidden sanctuary, understanding both the practical and symbolic importance of what he'd accomplished. Mr. Rourke, a woman approached him with the respectful manner of someone who understood the significance of what she was seeing. "I'm Dr. Patricia Williams from Howard University. My great-great-grandmother's photograph is in your collection." Jack had become accustomed to these encounters, descendants of the people Thomas had helped, drawn to the museum by news coverage and genealogical research. Each visit was a reminder that the treasure they'd found wasn't gold or historical artifacts, but connections to courage that had been passed down through generations. "Which photograph?" Jack asked, though he suspected he already knew. The young woman holding the child's hand. "According to family stories, my great-great-grandmother Sarah Jackson passed through this area in 1864. On her way to Canada with her son, Jack led Dr. Williams to the display case that held the daguerreotype Tommy had first discovered. The woman in the photograph gazed out with the same dignity and strength that Jack recognized in her descendant. "We've been hoping someone from her family would find us," Jack said. "We have letters too, personal items that Thomas kept safe, hoping they could someday be returned to their rightful owners." As he watched Dr. Williams examine her ancestors' belongings with tears in her eyes, Jack understood that they'd accomplished something more important than finding treasure. They'd restored connections that slavery had tried to destroy, giving families back pieces of their history that had been lost for generations. Sarah appeared beside him, having driven out from Columbus for the museum's monthly board meeting. Their relationship had evolved from antagonism to genuine partnership as she'd taken on the legal and administrative challenges of running a historical site that attracted national attention, the National Park. "Service called this morning," she said. "They want to discuss designating the site as a National Historic Landmark. What do you think?" "I think Tommy would never forgive us if we turned down the chance to have his great-great-great-grandfather officially recognized as an American hero." Through the museum windows, Jack could see visitors exploring the grounds, where archaeologists continued to discover additional caches and artifacts. The property that had once seemed like a burden was now revealing secrets that would take years to fully understand and preserve. Martha Henley, now the museum's official historian, approached with a group of elementary school students who listened with rapt attention as she explained how ordinary people had accomplished extraordinary things through courage and determination. And the most important lesson Martha was telling the children is that everyone's family has stories worth discovering. Everyone's ancestors did something important, even if those stories haven't been written in history books yet. Jack walked outside to the restored barn, where the original tools and equipment were displayed alongside interpretive materials that explained how the building had served multiple purposes: working farm, underground railroad station, and secret treasury for Union Army gold. But his favorite part of the museum was the small section dedicated to Robert Rourke's story. The displays explained how a man who'd been dismissed as a failure had actually been a brilliant inventor whose ideas had revolutionized modern agriculture. His patents finally credited to their true creator, were being used to fund agricultural development programs in communities that needed them most, the settlement. Money, the full $400 million, had been placed in trust funds that would support the museum, provide college scholarships for students interested in history and archaeology, and fund preservation projects for other Underground Railroad sites across the country. Jack had kept enough to secure his and Tommy's future, but the majority went toward ensuring that stories like Thomas Rourke's would continue to be discovered and shared. Tommy emerged from the barn, leading a group of visitors toward the vault entrance. At 13, he'd grown into his role as the museum's youngest expert, capable of answering complex questions about 19th century engineering, Civil War logistics, and archaeological methodology, with an enthusiasm that made even the most skeptical visitors believers in the importance of preserving family history. The coolest thing, Jack heard Tommy explaining to the tour group, is that my great-great-great-grandfather designed the whole system so that only his family could find it. The compasses, the genetic markers, the way the clues built on each other, it was like the world's most elaborate treasure hunt. But with a purpose that went way beyond money. Jack smiled as he listened to his son's explanation. Tommy had found more than treasure in that old barn. He'd found his calling. The boy who'd once been sullen and withdrawn was now planning to study archaeology in college, inspired by the discovery that ordinary families could uncover extraordinary histories. As the afternoon tour groups departed, Jack found himself alone in the farmyard where everything had started. The compass, both the brass one from his father's coffee can and the silver one from the bank vault, rested in a display case inside the museum. Their work finally complete, but sometimes, in quiet moments like this, Jack could still feel their pull. Not toward buried treasure, but toward the understanding that every family, every property, every carefully preserved story held the potential for discovery. His phone buzzed with a text message from a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Rourke, I'm researching my family's Underground Railroad connections and believe my ancestors may have passed through your area in 1863. Would it be possible to visit your museum and examine your collection? Jack smiled as he typed his response. All souls welcome. When would you like to visit? The treasure hunt that had begun with a falling down barn and a father's desperate need for a fresh start had evolved into something much larger, a living testament to the courage of ordinary people who'd risked everything to do what was right. As Jack walked back toward the farmhouse, where Sarah and Tommy were planning the next day's activities, he caught sight of his reflection in the museum's window. The man looking back at him bore little resemblance to the broken, desperate person who'd inherited this property 6 months earlier. This version of Jack Rourke stood straighter, smiled more easily, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd discovered his true purpose. He'd found financial security, but more importantly, he'd found his place in a story that stretched back through generations and forward into a future where his family's legacy would continue to inspire others. The real treasure hadn't been gold coins or historical artifacts or even the life-changing settlement money. The real treasure had been the discovery that he came from a family of people who'd spent their lives protecting things that couldn't be replaced. Freedom, dignity, hope, and the belief that tomorrow could be better than today. Sometimes the things that break your heart the most really are the only things that can save you. Jack Rourke had learned that truth in a barn that everyone else had called worthless, guided by compasses that pointed not just toward buried treasure, but toward the understanding that every family's story is worth preserving, protecting, and sharing with the world. The barn stood straight and strong again, its red paint bright against the Ohio sky, ready to welcome visitors for generations to come. And somewhere in its restored rafters, the spirit of Thomas Rourke could finally rest, knowing that his faith in family, his commitment to justice, and his belief in the power of ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things would never be forgotten.